Welcome. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Welcome to the public discussion of the 2021 Curatorial Leadership Summit. This conversation will conclude the year-long three-part series, Museums as Monuments. Valerie Cassel Oliver is the Sidney and Frances Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to her position at the VMFA, she was Senior Curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, where she worked from 2000 to 2017. In 2000, she was one of 6 curators selected to organize the biennial for the Whitney Museum of American Art, and her 2018 debut exhibition at the VMFA was a 50-year survey of work by Howardina Pindell entitled Howardina Pindell, What Remains to be Seen. The exhibition, which she co-organized with Naomi Beckwith, then the Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, was named one of the most influential of the decade. Most recently, Valerie Cassel Oliver organized the exhibition Cosmologies from the Tree of Life that featured over 30 newly acquired works from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. Her current exhibition, The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse, which opened at the VMFA in May in 2021 and is now traveling. Cassel Oliver is also the recipient of a Getty Curatorial Research Fellowship, High Museum of Art's David C. Driscoll Award, and the James A. Porter Book, among many other awards and fellowships. Laurie Stokes-Sims is a specialist in modern and contemporary art, craft, and design, who has been committed to a diverse and inclusive global art world and artists whose identities and work reflect those values. Sims holds a BA in art history from the Queens College of the City University of New York, a MA in art history from Johns Hopkins University, and a master's in philosophy and PhD in art history from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. Sims served on the educational and curatorial staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and as executive director, president, and adjunct curator for the permanent collection at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Sims retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Arts and Design, New York, where she served as the Charles Bronfman International Curator and the William and Mildred Ladson Chief Curator. She has served as guest curator consultant at the Caribbean Culture Center African Diaspora Institute, the McNally Art Museum, Grounds for Sculpture, the Craft Museum, the Museum of African Diaspora, San Francisco, the Contemporary Arts Center, Cincinnati, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History and Culture. Also, I just wanted to note that she has recently wrote the essay for the just opened Frederick Brown exhibition at Bruce Campbell, which is currently on view. It is with great pleasure to introduce Valerie Cassel Oliver and Laurie Stokes-Sims. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Laurie, what a delight it is. We are on, aren't we? This is hot. I feel it. What a thrill it is to sit here with you. Someone I've admired for so many years, who is a pioneer in her own right. And one of the reasons I really wanted to bring Laurie to the table, so to speak, is because this year-long series, Our Museum's Monuments, is really about the moment. It was born out of the moment and thinking about the demands that the public had for institutions such as museums and wanting them to be reflective and a certain insistence and an urgency, which quite honestly is not new. So really just to kind of bring a historical perspective to this kind of conversation. There were pandemics before this pandemic, the multiple pandemics of not only COVID, but of racism, which is once again so prevalent in our society that's forcing a kind of reckoning. But that reckoning happened many years ago. I feel this is a cycle, and I wanted to kind of honor that history by bringing these primary stories to the fore. And so, Laurie, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. I'll do anything for you, Valerie.
And you know,
Even if I don't want to.
and she knows that this is reciprocal, because you know I will do anything for you as well. She's going to put that to the test, y'all. I'm just showing. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. Laurie's like, I've said this, I've talked about this so many times, and I said, look at this audience. Are any of these people been in the audience when you've had these conversations?
A few.
A few. All right. Well, you're going to learn something new today, okay? Laurie,
Yes, Valerie.
when and where do you begin in this thing called the art world?
Oh. Well, I guess in my mother's womb. Because growing up in Queens, my mother, who had grown up in Harlem during the Depression, had, I don't know, there was nobody else in her family who was so interested in culture. And she figured out she was poor, but that didn't mean that she couldn't partake of culture. So we grew up with the idea in the 1950s and 60s, which was still possible, that you go to museums because they're free, you get a library card because that's free, and you go to the symphony, the ballet, at the theater with standing room seats, and then at intermission you move down to the seats where people didn't come. So that's sort of basically it. I mean, and she and my father took me and then my brother and sister who came along later to every cultural institution and that you could think of in the sort of New York, greater New York area.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about when and where you entered the field,
Yeah.
at the Met in particular,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just lay the lay of the land. What did those museums look? What did the Met look like in '72? So
72.
in
Yeah.
1972, what did it look like? What did it feel like in terms of coming in as a woman of color,
Right.
into that institution?
Well, I think that I would refer all of you to Susan Cahan's book, Mounting Frustrations, Museums in the Age of Black Power, because I read that book and I said, oh, that's why that happened. You know, because Susan went into the archives and found all the dirty secrets, you know, there. So it's kind of interesting, you know, just sort of thinking about the Met at that point. I was still in grad school when I came up to New York to see Henry Gelzella's show, New York Painting and Sculpture from 1940 to 1970. And I was in graduate school, and I was sort of trying to vacillate whether I was going to segue to African art or contemporary art. And I think that that show kind of made the decision for me, to walk into the second floor galleries of the Met and see all those incredible large paintings. I mean, mostly white men, but we won't hold that against them. And also very few women, but there was, I think, Louise Nevelson. And so I just sort of said, oh, this is kind of cool. You know, this is what, you know, like we should do. So I went back to graduate school, and I think from high school I had been interested in writing, history, and art altogether. In college, I found out I could make that into a major. And in line with my parents' idea of what I could do to sort of make a living, I thought I'd go into teaching art. I would get a PhD and be a professor in art history. But then Joy Sales intervened. Joy Sales was a young African-American woman working at the Brooklyn Museum in 1970 when I graduated from school. And she contacted me through her husband, Bill Sales, and Bill and I were working for the SEEK program at Queens College, tutoring. I was tutoring art, and he was tutoring poli-sci. And they had this interesting project. Mike Cahan, who was the curator of African art, had persuaded Merton Simpson. These are all names you all need to know. Merton Simpson was the first and the most prominent African American to deal African art. And sitting in his gallery, you saw some of the most extraordinary examples of traditional African art come through. And he had given a suitcase full of objects expressly to be taken out to the public schools in Brooklyn and to talk to kids about African art. So Joy and I packed up this suitcase and went into the public schools of Brooklyn. Now, you have to understand, I went to Catholic school all my life. In Catholic school, the nuns walked into the room, you stood up, you said, "Good morning, Sister so-and-so," and she gave you permission to sit down. Now, I did that the first day of college at Queens College, and these people looked at me like I was crazy. So I walked into my first public school ever, and I thought it was recess, but actually it wasn't. So we started this, I think we worked with about 1 or 2 schools, and we started bringing out this, you know what African art looks like. It's essentially naked people with, symbols on their bodies. They have big schlongs and big boobs. And you're dealing with sort of 11, 12, and 13-year-old kids. The thing that was so fascinating was that we found out that these kids had they were mostly African American, had absolutely no relationship to Africa at all. To them, Africa was Tarzan and the chimp, and anything that was African was funny and to be laughed at, despite the fact that they resemble things. So we had to go into a whole kind of background where we got slides of, like African children to sort of show how they looked like them, And we started showing African art and sort of really interrogating their sense of what was appropriate and what beauty was. So I remember when one day we put up a Galede mask from the Nigeria, and it has broad features and stuff, and so they're all laughing at the image when we put it up. So I said, "So what are you laughing at?" And they went, "He has a big nose and big lips." And I said, "Oh, okay." So they didn't say anything about black because the Galede masks tend to have more color. So I put up this slide of a black woman from the Sudan who was ink black, and she had thin nose and thin lips. And I said, "Is this better?" And they kind of went, "Oh." So then we could have a discussion about how they saw themselves and how they saw black people, in general. So I thought then I could sort of go into museum education. So 1972, I was finishing my master's at Hopkins. I was in a PhD program, but I was seeing all my classmates taking 10 years to finish a doctorate, and I needed to get out and get a job. So I finished off a real master's and went and looked for a job, and I knew nothing about museums, I went to them, but I knew nothing about how they worked. So I did what I understood you did to looking for a job. You send out a resume, then about a week later, you put on your best dress, your white gloves, and you show up, which is essentially what I did. At the National Gallery, the head of education, Margaret Bolton, she came out and she went, "Nobody has ever done this in terms of just show up looking for a job." So she sent me back to New York, and I, took the GSA or whatever the test you had to take, and I got the job. And I had my first assignment when the Met called. Now, the Met was a totally different situation because they had a political situation coming out of Harlem on My Mind.
Yes.
We all know about Harlem on My Mind. And
Well, you might need to remind a few people what
remind a few
Harlem
people.
Yeah,
Harlem on My
yeah.
Mind was the Met's, I think, first foray into diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility, which
Epic fail.
it wasn't an epic fail. We got James Van Der Zee out of it. It wasn't
True.
epic.
That is true.
It was not
That
an
is very
epic fail.
Thank
It
you.
was not.
It was a fail.
It was a misstep. It was a misstep, I think. It was just expectations were not matched. The art community of New York, specifically in Harlem, thought that the exhibition would be paintings and sculptures by artists in Harlem. And essentially, Alan Schoner put together a photo essay on Harlem that featured prominently the photography of James Van Der Zee. So it wasn't a total failure. It was a miscommunication. So coming out of the protest and everything, they formed the Department of Community Programs, which is supposed to be the outreach. Also politically, in New York at the time, the Met is one of, like the Studio Museum, El Museo del Barrio, the American Natural History Museum. There's like 34 organizations called the CIGs. And they get much of their operating budget from the city that is mitigated through the Board of Estimate of the City of New York. At the time, the Board of Estimate was made up of the borough presidents of New York. So what Hoving did was he played a card to sort of get and sort of, preserve the Met's allocation, which had been a long-term allocation, because Eleanor Holmes Norton, who now represents DC, was then head of the Equal Opportunity Commission, and she had an affirmative action lean against the Met to promote black people. So essentially, I got the job at the Met because of Harlem on my mind, and then got my job as a curator because of Eleanor Holmes Norton. So the interesting thing is that all the contacts that I made when I was in community programs, because I went out and we worked with the American Indian House, El Museo del Barrio, the Studio Museum, the Queens Museum, the Chinese Basement Workshop. I found myself with a kind of really multicultural cohort of people who I am friendly with today and whom I have collaborated with for over 50 years. And that's basically how we got things started.
Which is amazing.
Yes.
And you were there when Dr. Regina Perry was there as well.
That's right. She was a Rockefeller Senior Fellow.
That's right.
And Regina, do you all know Regina Perry? Regina Perry is like this force, irresistible force of nature. Regina takes no from nobody. And she came in and she was determined to do a show of 19th century African American artists, and the American wing was just as determined that she was not going to do the exhibition. Long story short, she did the exhibition. Enough said.
Yeah. Same year as David Driscoll.
Yes.
Very interesting, 1976,
Yeah.
I believe. So, given the idea that museums, were being challenged at that time, you came in this kind of groundswell. Your place there, was that a space where you fell into a place of advocating, or was it a place that you were positioned in a space, or did that not really follow you, so to speak? Were you able to do the projects you wanted to do, or was there a kind of compulsion to somehow respond to the sort of mounting frustration, if you will?
I think it was a kind of combination of all of the above. Mm-hmm. I think if the museum faltered, I had my cohort outside the museum that would support me and I would support them. So I would say for the first 15, 16 years that I was a curator, I did more work outside of the museum than I did inside the museum, because I knew that I could not allow the museum to be the only arbiter of my work, and also that I could not sort of truncate my development curatorially, waiting for permission to do things. So I would say that the Stuart Davis show that I did with Bill Agee in 1988-89 was essentially the first big show that I had at the Metropolitan Museum. This coincided with me getting the Frank Jewett Method Award from the College Art Association for Distinction in Art History. And it was really funny because my colleagues would, would look at me and go, what did you get that for? Because implicit in their question was, because we haven't given you anything to do. And I said, well, all that outside work that I did, that's what I got it for. And I think that that was the real bulwark. The first slide that you had, if we can go back to the first slide for a second. I mean, next one, sorry, I'm at these are the people, you know, who I worked with over the years in various ways. And these are the people, because you have to find a group of people who share your values and who will support you and who will take your calls at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're feeling particularly frustrated, and who will sort of give you jobs to do and you will give them jobs to do. So that was a key thing. I don't think I would be halfway where I am today without these people and many more people.
It's so wonderful. We had a conversation earlier, and it dawned on me that there was a particular ecology that existed in the art world at that time. You had alternative spaces.
Yes.
You had other spaces where museums, who are now asked to do a lot of heavy lifting, did not have to do that heavy. People could operate in different realms and create pressure from both internally inside of the museum and outside of the museum to really shift the conversations.
Yeah.
So the onus wasn't on the institutions. In fact, there was a sense of wanting to be let in, but also going about the work of establishing one's own, communal institutions. It was an explosion of museums that, began.
Right.
Studio Museum, Asian American museums, Mexican art museums, where people began establishing their own spaces, not pushing so much of trying to be a part of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that's an important thing, and I think that speaking about sort of alternatives to the Met, I should also mention that I was privileged to write about Betty Blayton Taylor, and that show's opening at Minution. And Betty, it was just such a pleasure to deal with her as an artist, because Betty was really known as an art administrator and educator, almost at the expense of her art. But she was also one of the founders of the Studio Museum in Harlem. So I think that what you're saying is kind of interesting, because I would say by the mid to late 80s, I think that the mainstream art world kind of caught on to this. And they wanted to sort of essentially co-opt the energy that was coming out of all these community and ethnically based, like museums. And I remember having this, I was on the council of the New York State Council at the time, and the director wanted to set up this system where you could get requests for proposals to do programming, for a diverse audience from, like any, like museum. And it was a thinly disguised way to give money to major museums to do the programs that smaller museums did, instead of giving further support to smaller museums to do the work they're going to do. And maybe if you wanted to do something with a major museum, you did it as a collaboration. And I would say that this situation is still today. The last year I've been working with something called the Creative Justice Initiative, which was started by Marta Vega, who was like the catalytic director of El Museo del Barrio for many years. She then started the Caribbean Cultural Center. She retired, went to Puerto Rico, and started another organization, the Curator Afro. And we started out having conversations that were going to be towards a conference, sort of discussing issues of creative justice. And then the COVID epidemic hit. And then we ended up talking a lot about how these organizations were going to survive, literally to survive. And we found that all the numbers that were coming up from the Alliance of American Museums and different foundations did not pull out smaller community-based organizations or ethnically specific organizations. So their financial situation was not being considered as many monies were being dispersed by foundations. So they did a survey, and we're sort of coming up with some, numbers, because it's an ongoing situation at this point.
Yeah, that's, and yes, the pandemic, multiple pandemics we've been contending with. There's so much facing museums of the moment, including these alternative spaces, these visual art spaces, very culturally specific museums. How do we grapple with these sort of strategies of curators in particular, but institutions of really meeting the demands? Does it seem very realistic to think that museums can sort of meet the demands that are now being thrust upon them, or being not necessarily thrust? I think that victimizes the museums, which in many cases have not owned up to many of the promises of the 70s, the late 1960s and 70s. So we're back at this place again, at these institutions. And I'm not sure exactly what do you really see are the most challenging aspects of this moment for institutions who are trying to lean in this moment. Truly lean in, not superficially lean in.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's slightly irresponsible for me to talk because I don't work in those institutions anymore.
Yeah.
Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. However, I'll tell you something interesting. I did an interview with my sister for the Library of the Performing Arts because, thanks to a friend of ours, her archives as a ballerina were added, to the Jerome Robbins collection, which she thought was hysterical because she worked with Jerome Robbins and he hated her. So, it's always good to sort of like be able to best revenge. And everything that's happening in museums is happening in every aspect of culture, as you know, and certainly ballet, is one of them. And it's been interesting to sort of see the lot of research of, black ballerinas that are being recognized. I mean, I think Misty Copeland was a kind of catalyst for this type of thing, but people are sort of saying, all respects to Misty, she wasn't the first, and that there were many. And my sister, despite the fact that she's gone on to sort of work in costuming, worked for Disney in Paris for 30 years, she's being slumped into this, kicking and screaming. And I talked to her I said to her, well, what do you feel about this critique of ballet as a kind of Eurocentric, form? And she said, well, look, frankly, she said, if I don't want to do ballet, a Eurocentric dance, I'll do modern dance. But she said, but I liked ballet. She says, I know what ballet is. Ballet is essentially a form from 18th century France, 17th, 18th century France. My participation in the ballet is because I liked the form. And what I felt was I could bring my interpretation to the form, and it wasn't necessary for me to transform ballet for what it is. If I wanted to do African dance, I would do African dance. I would not bring ballet into African dance or necessarily African dance into ballet, although some people probably would. And it's kind of interesting because on the internet these days, there's a lot of YouTubes of black ballerinas doing their stuff and doing interpretations of Swan Lake, Le Corsaire, all these, very strict ballets. And it is so fascinating to sort of watch these women, and just the only difference is that their skin might be brown. Michaela the Prince and people like that, they bring a certain elan and difference, to the ballet. I say that to say that when I was working at museums, I didn't think about transforming museums. A museum is what it is. It was an institution that sort of evolved out of a European sort of aristocratic collection, and the aristocrats decided, to sort of give some little culture to the working classes. There was a joke that the first job of curators was to make sure visitors to the collections had shoes on and to sort of collect a little money from them. That was essentially it. We had no illusions about the source of money, for museums. We had no illusions about the sort of aesthetic and sort of point of view of museums. But we knew we could have fun fucking with it. We could have lots of fun doing that. And so essentially, you asked me previously what I thought was my do. My job was to follow the dictates of Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in the belly of the beast and make revolution however I could. Now, it didn't mean to me that I was going to burn down something, because I'm much more of a subtle anarchist than that. But to sort of really figure out a situation, you have your overall mission of Lowery Sims in museums. 2, diversify the representation of art by diverse individuals, including people of color, women, and overlooked white males. And you just find every situation how you can do that, even if they didn't know it. My best fun was doing it under the cover of darkness, where something popped up, was presented, and nobody knew exactly how it got there. Okay? This idea of tearing down museums I find interesting. But I think that there were groups of people who founded El Museo del Barrio, who founded the Studio Museum, who founded the Alternative Museum. People need to remember Gino Rodriguez's Alternative Museum, which was very multicultural. It wasn't necessarily ethnically specific. Maybe the best way is to find your own museums and sort of figure out what you can do within larger museums to do it. Museums, when I think about destroying museums, I think about my friend Judy Cotton, who grew up in Australia and was dying to sort of get to the United States. Judy's 80 years old, so you can figure out when she was born, when she was young, and there weren't that many institutions in Australia. So for her to come to New York City was like nirvana. This kind of richness of museums that she wouldn't have. And I always think about people who grow up in areas where you don't have what we have here in New York. We take it for granted. Or Philadelphia, or Washington, or the big cities that have institutions. And sometimes these are places where people can come and have their first art experience, have that catalytic moment when they can figure out maybe they can be an artist, or there's a different way to sort of look at the world or something like that. So I think that museums need to change, the focus of their cultures, but more realistically, I think museums need to sort of figure out what their goals are. And in that way, I sort of think of a couple of people. Let's go on, because I think we can sort of get to, no, I think we want to go to the end. This is all about refining at museums, what's at stake, and the canon, and all this other kind of stuff. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Here, back. So these are some recent things that I've heard that I thought were very interesting. First, Dudley Koch, who's part of our creative justice. He's the only white guy in our creative justice initiative. And he said, one of our meetings, museums have to decide whether they want to build audiences or build communities. Now, let's just sort of think about that. It's a very subtle difference. Do you want to bring them in, tour them around, and send them home? Or do you want to bring them in and sort of, create a kind of conversation that can then sort of enrich and broaden the perspective of what's going on. It's a totally different. One is very exploitative, and the other one's very inclusive. And I thought that that was a really important thing. Darren Walker, awareness, and we all, are talking about being woke. Awareness is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because you have to put your money where your mouth is. So if you're woke, you got to get out of bed and do something about it. You just don't woke, okay? And then the other thing that I think Darren said that was really profound was those of us with power and privilege, and he included himself in this, and he was like a poor black boy from Texas who's now president of the Ford Foundation. Those of us with power and privilege must grapple with a more profound question: what are we willing to give up? Because in this dialogue about diversification, equality, inclusion, and accessibility, and I mean it's accessibility across the board. That's physically as well as mentally and emotionally, because people who are differently challenged physically have a stake in this whole thing too. What are you willing to give up to sort of make space, for another kind of voice, another kind of conclusion?
Well, it also speaks that museums themselves are in a state of change, whereas the finances are not just being given, the world of philanthropy is shifting. And there is a demand, there is a need for museums to move beyond this sort of space of building audience to building communities,
Right.
because it's a matter of survival at this point.
Right.
And I think that has to be acknowledged, that the dynamics are shifting under the ground from which they've been built.
Well, I mean, you cannot dismiss the impacts of social media, like in this way. And, the kind of dialogues that I should sort of preface by saying that I am a total Luddite and I'm not on anything. I am not on Facebook, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on nothing. LinkedIn is about all I do. But I'm aware. And I think that
Are you woke?
I'm sort of half awoke. I'm aware awoke, I only say that because it's hard for me to keep up with 3 email accounts. You know what I mean? It's just like, but I think that, like the ways that you can sort of create community is such a demand now, and you have to sort of do this if we're going to sort of get to the next stage of human development. And I think that I am very hopeful and encouraging of younger people for whom this is normative, and I think that they're going to lead the way.
Well, I mean, it does bring into a whole generational dimension now, There are younger curators
Yes.
who are coming to the table with a very different sensibility,
Right.
different sense of self,
Yes.
where, I mean, at some point I kind of felt like I'm in the museum, but do I belong in the museum? And they're like, oh, no, I belong here.
Yeah.
And this is my room over here. And I'm going to need this redecorated, all of this.
Well,
You know?
how did you know? That's what I did when I was 16 and I got my first membership at the Metropolitan Museum. I dragged my girlfriends there. Okay, now, red carpet up the grand stairs, Blumenthal patio. Do we think we want that for the dining room? Or do we want it? We redecorated the Metropolitan Museum to our, it was kind of large. We just worried about the cleaning bill. Oh God, who are we going to get to sweep these floors? Anyway, but yeah, I mean, it's this kind of familiarity with spaces, because I started working at the Institute of Fine Arts, which is catty corner from the Met, and it's an old frick. And so the human resources person was just giving me a tour of the whole thing, and the first thing she said to me was, "Now, Larry, I don't want you to be intimidated by this building." And I said, "Brenda, I worked at the Met. I know from building. I've worked in one of the biggest buildings. I said space and time. I think the only thing that has impressed me much is, if we can, when we get past terrorists and COVID and everything, go to Egypt and experience those temples. Now, that gives good space. Yeah. Anyway, so I think it's making people just familiar with different kinds of spaces and how they can do wayfinding through it.
Yeah, but I mean conceptually, how curators are walking into spaces and owning these spaces. I mean, owning them, meaning from a space of being a change agent within the institution. Yes. Whereas, there was some trepidation, there is that mentality, and it is all contingent on place. Some institutions are different, and we have to acknowledge some spaces are more nimble, they're smaller. Some institutions, which are more encyclopedic, like the Met, are more arduous. It's like moving a mountain, whereas some spaces are far more flexible, and you can change the dynamics of a space through an acquisition, through an exhibition, where we are inviting people to the table as community and not just as audience members. I think it's a very different sensibility, I feel. And I think that shift has happened over time, largely because of the work of what you've done, people who before you've done, your cohorts have done, has really enabled a certain kind of sure-footedness, flat-footedness. Now, it doesn't mean it's not met with resistance, because that's real.
Yeah, I think in all cases you need to be strategic, and you need to sort of know the space that you're working in and the politics of it. To go in and just wham, think you're going to sort of like change things, that's kind of suicidal.
Yeah, of course it is. So that kind of brings this notion about change and the right spaces of change. Again, it's all contingent. It's all very customized, but looking at a larger, bigger picture, what do you feel are the right pathways toward change or shifting, particularly within institutions?
Anything you can get at any time. Figure out what you want, what you change. Find allies in the institution, because you'd be surprised who agrees with you. They may not say it specifically. I don't think there's one program or one way that you can sort of like necessarily move through. I think we need to sort of have a little bit of nimbleness and a kind of sense of humor and mischiefness as we sort of really go through this. I think sometimes we get so serious about, like the whole mission. What me and my cohorts loved to do was to play.
Yeah.
And sort of really figure out what we could sort of really do. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes we weren't. But it never stopped us, and we always found different ways to sort of like bring people in. I remember I wanted to bring in an exhibition of Horace Pippin. It was organized by Judith Stein at the Pennsylvania Academy. And I knew my boss was not, my immediate boss in the 20th Century Art Department was not really that excited about it. But I happened to have coffee with the head of education, who sort of really understood how important it would be to do it. And I knew he had the ear of the director. So I sold it on him, and we had the show. Sometimes your path is not the usual path that they set in these kind of hierarchical things. And sort of breaking that and sort of finding a new path is very often the most effective thing that you can do. Sometimes you have to step back from your ego a little bit. I had a friend, my dear, dear, dear friend, Yale Nealon at the Met. Yale was like the most waspiest person you'd ever met. He was named Yale because his fucking family founded Yale University. I mean, for some bizarre reason, Yale and his wife Judy, who I spoke to before from Australia, we became the best of friends. Like I have this moment where Yale, a couple of years ago, we were talking about demographic change in the United States. And so I was like laying in a hammock on his place in Connecticut, and he came and he stood on the patio looking very important. And I said, Yale, what are you doing? I used to call him Harvard just to get me. I said, Harvard, what exactly are you doing? He says, Laurie, I'm standing here practicing being a minority. It was just like the most thing. But at the Metropolitan Museum, I knew that sometimes I had certain situations I had to get to where this was not going to work. So I would call up Yale, and I go, Yale, I have to do blah, 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 blah. The situation calls for a white guy in a blue shirt and chinos, so you have to go with me. And he used to say that I would pimp him out, and I did. Yeah. And sometimes people got it. And so then they would sort of like defer to me, because they know I show up with Yale. Hi. And I think that, those are some of the best times, like that I really had. But you have to be strategic. You have to be devious. You have to be nimble. You have to sort of really analyze what the situation is and sort of really figure out how you can get what you want. And sometimes it's not that straight line. It's not the line they taught you in school. It's not the line that the museum tells you is the procedure that you have to follow. You just have to smile and go around.
Beautiful. Well, we want to leave a little questions for our audience, space for our audience to ask questions. And, I will ask one last thing is, the sort of joy and fear. I'm going to say, what are the more optimistic feelings that you have about institutions like museums in this moment, in this particular moment? Because I think joy, sometimes in the midst of all of the struggle and stress, particularly that the pandemics have wrought, we forget that we're in institutions, or you've been in an institution. I'm in an institution because I truly enjoy it. It is a passion. It's something that I love doing. And I have an optimism about it, a stubborn optimism, but an optimism about it. And I wonder, you're now stepping away from institutions, but somehow being aligned with them still. I don't think you ever retire from the art world, ever. If there are spaces of optimism that you see on the horizon, or are you still feeling, I don't know, I'm just kind of being upbeat right now.
No, I think the great thing about museums, if people sort of really realize it, is that they're great gathering spaces. And we're hitting on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 at this moment. And I remember I was directing the Studio Museum at the time, and one of the, we were all, immediately caught up in, the populations of people, the first responders, there was, there was one big sort of finance company, Cantor Fitzgerald. They had all these companies of people who were impacted, but there were only two artists, and one was Michael Richards. And so the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council came to me and said, can we have a memorial for Michael Richards at the Studio Museum? And it happened to be a time where we were in between exhibitions, so our galleries were completely open. And the day of the memorial, the place was crammed with people because this was the one opportunity that the art world could have. We almost felt guilty thinking about the arts, at a time like this, but we did have our own sorrow, and we had lost one of ours. And it was really, to me, that was one of the things that always impressed me with the studio, and which I liked during the directorship of the museum to encourage, was that the museum could be a place of gathering of people on their own terms. So we had programs, I used to call them Sunday salons, so after church people could come and they'd have a program like this. We did one on church lady hats. Somebody had written a book on it, and everybody arrived with their hats, and thing. And I think it's a very simple kind of situation, but I think museums have very often the space and the sort of ambiance where they can really be very effective gathering spaces for their immediate communities if they want to. Beautiful.
Thank you,
You're
Laurie,
welcome.
for that. So we have some time for observations, questions, comments. Just raise your hand and wait for
Oscar has to
Aisha.
say it.
Yeah, Oscar Blayton. Here he is.
Laurie, what message would you want this audience to carry to the younger curators, particularly the women curators of color, people who have been excluded previously? What would you like for us to carry to them as a message as to what their charge should be?
Follow your passion, be smart, be strategic, and always have a posse.
I'm just so curious.
Noel, God damn it. Where the hell have you been?
I'm so curious about the nuance
I
of
can't
all-
understand you. Take your damn mask
the-
off.
It's so good to see you too. Thank you for being here. I was a bit fascinated by that nuance of audience and community, and I'm curious how gentrification impacts that.
Well, well, it seems to me the gentrification usually has to do with artist studios and galleries, like for the most part. That's a tricky one. I was interested to see how Boyle Heights fought back, really, and I think what happens in the art world is that, not just museums, but as individuals, gallerists, artists, curators, we think that we have good intentions, and that we can have good intentions without consulting with the people we think we have good intentions about, And I think that, there are different ways that you can sort of like work for it. I mean, the tragedy is that artists need inexpensive, accessible space the same way that poor and working class people do too, and sometimes the artist can bring different resources to it. So I think that that's a larger question. I wish I had all the answers for it, but I think that mainly sort of shifting our attitudes, that we're not the all, the fabulous, all, be all and end all of everything, and that our actions and our decisions and our desires and our needs have impact on somebody else, which is a good way to sort of lead your life anyway, is probably the answer. I wish I had a thing.
Hi, Laurie.
Yes, LaRon.
What do you think the importance of mentorship is?
What?
Of mentorship.
Oh, it's very important. So what do you want me to say? I mean,
Everything, Laurie,
I was
everything.
your mentor, right?
Yeah.
And now you're mentoring somebody else.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's the important thing, is to sort of share your experiences, like with young people, Yeah. No, I think that that's a key thing.
Thank you.
I don't know what other brilliant thing I can say about that, but
You said a lot. Thank you very much, Laurie. Appreciate it.
You've been nodding all through my.
I have a history question, because you're the beginning of this presentation. There's so much important history that I hope
Right.
more people know about. I am curious what you thought of, if you thought of, the Afro-American Artist Show Boston to New York that was hosted at the MFA Boston.
Yeah.
Barry Gaither, Barry Rubenstein,
right.
produced under duress. And how you feel like that played. Many people know about Harlem on My Mind.
Right.
Most
right.
people
but
don't
that was
talk
an important one.
about
yeah.
this show.
I think we kind of enjoyed the sort of like repartee in the press about it, you know, good old Hilton Kramer. Well, there was another show, because I came across this, and I'm trying to think if it's the same show I'm thinking about. No, I think it was a little earlier. There was a counterweight to the Whitney, and Betty was in that show, Betty Blayton. It was a rebuttal show in 1971 or something like
I
that.
think it was rebuttal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the rebuttal.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting that John Kennedy singled out Betty and Richard Mayhew and sort of said, what are they doing in here? Because they worked abstractly, that their work wasn't black. So, I mean, don't get me into like what's black art. No, please do not get me into that. Who's a black artist? Who ain't a black artist? What is black art? Please don't do that to me. Ugh. I've done it too many times. I don't know the answer either. But anyway, I think that was kind of, and the fact that it was Boston, how Boston got into this, I thought was like really fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. But, well, you had to be at dinner with Frank Bowling and Dana Chandler talking about a dinner table. Wow. What's black art and what's not black art.
Well, so much of this history is underknown.
Yep.
And, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful? I already put this out to her, and she's like, don't give me work to do. I think these primary stories so need to be told. I think this history needs to be cataloged and placed in a way, situated, where they're accessible. I know you retired and you got a lot of work to do. You still have a lot of work to do. We need you. That's why you're here. That's why you're still here. We ain't done with you. I'm not going to tell you what she just said to me. Suffice it to say, there's still a lot of work to be done. And,
Yes.
and you know, your favorite cohort, Leslie,
King. Yes, Leslie King.
I mean,
Hammond.
is on the prowl. She's about it.
Yep.
And it is so necessary. I think so many of us in the art world, we suffer from systemic amnesia. We do not remember the history, and oftentimes are asked to come into institutions where we do not know the histories.
Yeah, exactly.
To repeat the same thing over and over and over again. Enough of the insanity. So we need those stories,
All right.
darling.
Okay.
All right. All right, I think we are out of time. What do you want to say, last words?
No.
Okay. We are out of time.
Thank you for coming.
Always and often. Love you, dear. Thank you so much.